This is Conversations on Careers and Professional Life, a podcast from the Foster School of Business, MBA Career Management Office. I'm your host, Gregory Heller. On each episode, I talk with guests from faculty and staff to students and business leaders about the skills and strategies that can help you design a professional life that you're happy with. My guest on this episode is Ruchi Singh. At the time of our interview in the spring of 2019, Ruchi is a first-year student. She's the incoming president of the Foster Consulting Society and will be doing her internship at Deloitte during the summer of 2019. During this interview, we talk about the Consulting Society and its plans for the 2019-2020 school year, and about Ruchi's experience preparing for internship recruiting at consulting firms. So tell me, what do you have planned for the Consulting Society?
So many exciting things. So our second years did a really good job of putting together a very thorough curriculum that I think most first years who were recruiting for consulting really benefited from, and we're planning to take that to the next level. So kind of thinking about recruiting almost as a fifth class. So we're thinking every Friday, once the quarter is up and running, we're going to have prep sessions. So that will include things like casing 101, consulting math, focusing on resume and behavioral question prep. So we'll kind of guide the incoming class through a lot of those items. And in addition to the education piece, we're also trying to increase Foster's footprint with the consulting firms, both on a national level as well as the firms that are locally based in Seattle. And so as we're thinking about that, we're planning to host company-specific office hours. We're planning to host company-specific training sessions as well. Consulting firms can be very different in the types of interviews that they have, so providing very targeted tips on how to interview for different firms, and then also just increasing the alumni interaction that we have.
For students who are coming into the program and thinking about trying to get a consulting internship, as well as for students who might be thinking about recruiting full-time for consulting, what are some of the most important things that they can start doing right now, whenever it is that they hear this podcast right now?
That's a really good question, and I'm glad you mentioned right now or when they hear it, which is hopefully well before August. I think one thing that we have to keep in mind, and something I realized when I went to a number of pre-MBA conferences, is we're not just competing with the folks that we go to school with here. We're competing with all of the other top business schools and all of the students that go there. So if you think about that and think about when sort of schools on the East Coast are in session, when they start getting access to a lot of, their career management and access to materials, that is sometimes almost 2 months ahead of us here on the West Coast because we're on the quarter system. So I think timing is really important. I would highly recommend that if you're interested in consulting, you start as soon as possible. It really is never too early. So I would say you have time over the summer, so use that time wisely. And that's a great time to start reading some of the case books that different authors have out there to get you geared up for case prep. And then more than that, have a think about what are the types of firms that you're looking to recruit with, and start reaching out to, for example, Foster alumni at these firms for informal coffee chats. And that's a really good time to get to know the firms on a more informal level and sets you up nicely for more formal networking come the fall and when you come on campus. And another reason it's important to do it early is because, as I'm sure you will hear from many sources, fall quarter is very busy. So the more you can get this legwork done earlier, the better it is.
I think that's great advice. I don't think most people realize just how fast the water comes out of the fire hose.
Yes, exactly.
When you start classes in October.
Yeah.
You mentioned case books, case prep books. We obviously bring some case experts to campus, David Ohrvall and Marc Cosentino, during the year. What are some of the books that you found or resources that you found indispensable in your preparation?
So I would say Marc Cosentino's Case in Point is almost like the Bible for consulting recruiting. So that's a really good place to start. I also really liked Victor Cheng's case book, Case Secrets. And that's a really good book because Marc Cosentino does a really good job of providing frameworks. And then Victor Cheng kind of, I find, takes that to the next level because he teaches you how to make those frameworks your own so that when you are doing an actual case, you don't sound like you're just regurgitating a casework or framework that you learned about in one of the books. So I think Victor Cheng kind of makes it a little more personal. You have the option to kind of customize how you case. So those, I would say, are the two books that I used. Also, I find that David Ohrvall has videos on his website. Victor Cheng has videos on his website. Those are helpful to watch. They've recorded live cases, and so you can hear kind of what are some of the things or good things that people do and what are some things that you perhaps shouldn't do. And I particularly found the cases that didn't go so well to be really helpful in terms of just kind of remembering what are things to avoid. And then finally, I'd say if you are ready, if you feel like you're ready to get started on casing, just thinking about how you would build your own frameworks is a good place to start. I wouldn't say start doing that in the summer necessarily because you don't want to over practice it either. But just thinking about if I get posed a high level strategy question, what's sort of my way of telling that story? I think those are good places to start.
At what point did you start your preparation?
I may be an exception to the rule, but I'm more of a planner. So I would say I started when I found out that I'd be going to Foster and I made the decision to come here. So for me, that was sort of April. And then May is when I started thinking about, now I have some time, I've quit my job, let me get a start on reading some of these books. And I'd say the bulk of my networking and coffee chats I did before we started Jumpstart in August. So the Forte conference, for example, was really helpful in kind of providing a launching pad for that. That's when I met Deloitte for the first time. I met Bain and McKinsey for the first time at the conference as well. So I kind of used that opportunity to start building up my network at these firms.
How many case practices would you say that you did before you sat for your first case interview with a firm?
So my interviews were all early January, right around January 5th. And before that, I'd done close to 40 full cases. And that 30 to 40 seems to be sort of the sweet spot in terms of what others in second years have recommended to us as well. I will say that given how busy fall was, I started up by first doing case starts, which are just thinking about how do you frame the problem. And once I felt comfortable with case starts, I ramped up cases. So especially over winter break, I was doing about 5 cases a week. So still thinking about casing all through full quarter, but I definitely ramped up my effort close towards the end.
What would you say is a realistic estimate of how much time a student should prepare to spend on preparing for case interviewing in the fall quarter and winter break?
So I'd say in the fall quarter, on the lower end, at least 2 hours, just thinking whether that means giving a peer a case or receiving a case. Both are really valuable in terms of learning how to case well. I usually do a case myself before I give it to someone else, just so it's good practice for me too. And those are just best practices that I was told by second years. But in addition to just the 2 hours, I'd say maybe in December, I was probably spending at least an hour and a half to 2 hours a day. So I think over break, it probably goes up to maybe 10-ish hours a week.
Okay, so it's a real commitment. And then you said the interviews all happened in early January. How many firms did you interview with?
I interviewed with 4 different consulting firms. So I interviewed with BCG, Bain, Deloitte, and Oliver Wyman for consulting.
Would you say that the behavioral interview is significantly different for a consulting firm than it is for other industries?
No. I also interviewed for private wealth management, and I'd say the behavioral portion is the same across all industries. I can't speak for tech or any other ones, but generally speaking, I think when they're trying to gauge fit and trying to evaluate your leadership abilities and just strengths and weaknesses that you bring to the table, it's fairly consistent across the board. And I think it's a really good question that you ask about behavioral, because even for me personally in my own practice, I did find myself leaving behavioral for later, and I would advise people to not do that. I don't think I made a huge mistake, but because I generally am comfortable in my communication skills, but I think it's very important to spend a good amount of time preparing for those questions. It's really important that you sound very concise and crisp in the way you deliver your answer, because especially for consulting firms, you're going to be client facing, and your ability to communicate in a concise manner really will set you apart from other candidates.
So you would say that the preparation that you do for behavioral interviews, if you're preparing for industry outside of consulting, can do double duty.
Exactly.
Yeah. And how many mock behavioral interviews do you think you did before you started interviewing?
So I did 2. I believe both of them were with you, and those were very helpful. I definitely, for my first one, if I recall, I hadn't prepared too much, but just walking through my answers with you and kind of hearing you repeat some of that information, I found to be really valuable. I think sometimes it's intimidating to do those, whether you're prepared or not, but I find that learning by doing works best, especially in this scenario. So I would highly encourage doing the mock interviews. For my second round, I believe I had asked you to focus more on questions that I had struggled with the first time. And I'm so glad I did that, because 2 of the questions that I practiced with you the second time around were questions that I got asked, one in my consulting interview and one in my finance interview. So very valuable use of time there.
I'm glad it turned out well.
Yeah.
So let's get back to the Consulting Society.
Yeah.
At what point can students join?
Formally, in terms of joining, I believe we have a club fair scheduled for later in September towards the end. So at that point, you can pay your dues and become a formal member of the Consulting Society. But we understand that people are applying to pre-MBA conferences and going to pre-MBA events. So the board's information is up on our website, and you are more than welcome to reach out to any one of us. And we're very happy to help with any kind of questions, whether it's about firms, whether you need help with resumes or interview prep, things like that. But formally, you can become a member once school is in session.
Okay, and we can put the link to that website in the show notes.
Yes.
When students become a member, what do they get?
They get access to a bunch of different resources that we have to offer, and one of them is our casebook. And the casebook is really important because it gives you step-by-step guidance on how to solve different cases. I believe that's what a lot of people used to practice as they were prepping for interviews. We also have access to casebooks from other schools. So that's really helpful, because sometimes you just need more operations-focused cases, or maybe there's, break-even analysis, and that's something that you're struggling with. So having access to just other casebooks is helpful, because sometimes it's hard to find good cases, and there's only so many we can put in our own casebook. So you will get access to a lot of different casebooks. You will have access to all of the educational programming that we have prepared. We are also going to provide the members with access to alumni. So if you are interested in specific firms and you want to help get an in with the firms in terms of knowing who to reach out to, whom the recruiting captains may be, we will have access to that information, and we're happy to connect folks with the respective folks at the firms as well. For the consulting club members, we're also hoping this year to offer one-on-one prep or mock interviews with our alumni at the respective firms. So this isn't something that's set in stone, because we're still figuring out the kinks, but the plan is, for one day, probably late November, we'll have an alumni from BCG come to campus. You'll be able to sign up for a 1-hour mock interview with this person, and they'll give you feedback. And that's really helpful, because you'll have then December break to look over that feedback and prepare for your interviews accordingly. So those are some of the things. One big event that we also do in the fall is our winter social, and that's a really good place to meet consultants as well. We had last year, I believe, over 35 different consultants who were present at the event.
How important is it to do that networking with the firms before you're applying and sitting for interviews?
I think it's really, really important, and it's an important part of their process as well, because as much as you want to get to know them, they want to get to know you. And the other reason why I say it's important to start early is because when you do start early, it really shows your commitment towards the firm. And you can kind of ramp that up over the fall if you've started back in the summer. I know that there are certain firms who really care about how much effort you have put into getting to know them. Firms will often, towards the end of fall quarter, have invite-only happy hours or invite-only dinners. And if you've networked with a number of people and your name is a name that many people at the firm know of, you'll likely get an invite to those dinners. So, and that will give you access to perhaps more senior level folks working at those firms. And that typically is something that's hard to have access to very early on. So I think networking is a really important part of trying to recruit for a consulting firm. The other thing that they're looking for when they are kind of meeting with you for informal coffee chats is just your presence. It's how you communicate. It's how you deal with the unknown to an extent, because if you think of a coffee chat with a consultant as the consultant being your client, I think that's a really good mental space to be in. You know, you can then show off kind of how you interact with people. So those are also, they're evaluating you a little bit even in that process. So I find that those informal coffee chats, the pressure isn't as high, so you can be set up really well to perform at your best and kind of get yourself an interview later on.
That's great advice, I think, right there. One thing that sometimes people, I think, miss is the importance of doing that networking, making those connections. And I would say it's not just for the consulting firms. It's in a lot of jobs that can be very helpful. I think it just has a little bit more weight in the consulting firms. Talk to me about some of the resources that you used from career management. Obviously, we did some mock interviews. Were there other things that you found useful?
Yes. So I, as I mentioned, started early in the spring/summer with my prep. I knew going into the program that I was going to be really busy in the fall and decided that I was going to take the summer to work on my resume and cover letter. So that career management was super helpful, and I'm grateful that they took the time out in the summer to review all of those things for me. So I scheduled a couple of appointments with different career coaches here in career management, even before I had started school and once I moved to Seattle. So there were a lot of iterations on the resume, and before I started, my resume was finalized, which really saved me a lot of time in the fall. And the same thing for cover letters. I mean, I made tweaks later on, but I would say that was sort of the biggest resource that I utilized. And even just thinking about going into these pre-MBA conferences, you have to upload a copy of your resume. So the sooner you can get started on that, the better. And career management, I felt, was very open to spending time with me on walking me through that process.
Yeah, I think it is worth underscoring that the career coaches here, myself included, begin working with students as soon as they've accepted their offer of admissions to the school. And that really does ramp up over the summer. And again, I think that people underestimate how busy October gets.
I agree.
And the more that you can do in the summer, especially around getting that resume dialed in and starting to work on cover letters and develop your target company list and find the contacts who you want to reach out to, the better you'll be in October.
I also want to add that while the Consulting Society does have a lot of connections and we have alumni that we've stayed in touch with over the years, I think career management obviously has built those relationships on even a higher level. So while Consulting Society is always here as a resource, it's also important to remember that we can also always reach out to our career coaches if there's someone very specific that we are trying to target. And I found that everybody was very willing to make introductions when I needed them. So I definitely would mention that as a resource to keep an eye out for as well.
That's great. Is there any other advice that you would offer to incoming MBA students that you know now that you wish other people could know when they start? What would it be?
That's a tough one. But I guess if I had to pick one, I would say figure out what your non-negotiables are in the fall, which means decide what you want to prioritize on. Academics are important, but getting a job is also important, and making friends and being social is also important. But sometimes one or two of those things may have to take a little bit of a backseat as you gear up for other things that you really want to focus on. So I'd say figure out what your non-negotiables are and stick to them through the quarter as much as you can. I think the people who came in very focused and knew kind of what they wanted to do are the ones who accomplish what they set out to do as early as possible. So that would be my advice.
I think it's great advice. Are there any other resources, books, articles, podcasts that you think people should be aware of?
Well, your podcast to
right
start,
here, yeah, but
right
they have
there.
to be listening to
exactly.
this.
So if you're listening to this, you are all set.
Yeah. Tell your friends.
Exactly. But in addition to that, I'd say two things. One, for any kind of interview, whether and especially consulting, definitely read the Wall Street Journal, read The Economist, know what's going on. I know that you don't have to have a certain professional background or pedigree to recruit into consulting firms. But given that the nature of the work, you're expected to know a little about a lot of different things. And that's not going to happen if you start reading the journal a week or two before your interview. So as early as you can start and kind of make that a habit, that's a really good place to start. And that's a really good resource. The other thing that I also would recommend is you have a lot of resources on campus in that you are surrounded by some really amazing people, whether that's your peers, whether that's your second years, whether that's evening students or career management. Definitely take advantage of that. I sometimes feel like when people get busy, you kind of tend to just kind of put your head down and work, but there's a lot of value that comes with practicing cases with other people, doing a mock interview with your peers, and sometimes when you do a mock interview with someone else, you're able to get a lot of objective feedback. So I'd say do that earlier in the fall quarter when you are just starting to ramp up, and don't kind of leave that for later.
One of the things that I often tell people is that, if you come in and you only mock with me or another coach, your assigned coach, oftentimes people find the one that they like, the person they have the connection with. You start to get familiar with that person.
Exactly.
And comfortable.
Yeah.
Which is great for our relationship, but you're going to go into that interview room with someone who you might never have met before.
Yeah.
So the more different people that you can have a mock interview with, the more prepared you'll be to be in a room with someone that's unfamiliar to you.
Exactly. And to echo that and take that a step further, it also applies to cases. I feel like when you are doing case prep, you're doing public math, and sometimes that can be intimidating for a lot of people. I know it was for me. And the natural tendency is to case with your friends and is to case with people that you're comfortable with. But interviews are intimidating. Interviewers sometimes can be intimidating on purpose. So put yourself in the most uncomfortable situation in school, which is a very safe environment, just echoing what you said.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about your experiences and the Consulting Society.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
The overarching message from Ruchi and other students I've worked with who've successfully landed internships and full-time roles in consulting is to start your preparation early, really dig into the case prep before school even starts in the fall, and have a plan to sustain that prep through the fall quarter. Don't neglect the networking and stay current on business news. You can learn more about the Consulting Society on the website uwfostermbaa.com/consulting-society, or find the link in the show notes. I'll also provide links to the books that Ruchi mentions. Thank you for listening to another episode of Conversations on Careers and Professional Life. I'd love to hear what you think about the podcast. You can email me at gheller@uw.edu. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend or classmate.